The scout ship Ashvale Current dropped out of transit 300 kilometers above the wreck of Kes 9, and for a long moment nobody on the bridge said anything at all. Below them, the colony's orbital ring hung in pieces, a broken bracelet of dark metal turning slowly against the stars. Debris fields stretched for 1,000 kilometers in every direction, the wreckage of two fleets that had fought each other to nothing 3 days earlier. And in the middle of it, tumbling end over end with its reactor bleeding a thin trail of blue fire into vacuum, was a single human warsuit. It should not have still been transmitting. That was the first thing that struck Ensign Dorothy Van, youngest officer on the bridge, when the sensor array pulled up the signal. A structure that damaged should have gone dark hours ago. Instead, buried under the wreck's radiation signature, a weak, steady pulse kept repeating on an open frequency, over and over, patient as a heartbeat. "Signal's not a distress call," Dorothy said, frowning at her console. "It's not asking for anything. It's just broadcasting numbers." Commander Thessaly leaned over her shoulder, for long fingers tapping against the rail of the command chair. Thessaly had served 11 years in the Vel Concord Survey Corps, had catalogued the dead of a dozen wars that weren't hers, and had never once seen a signal behave like that. "Life signs?" she asked. "One," Dorothy said. "Human. Faint. Core temperatures crashing and the suit's reactor is at 4% and falling. Whoever's in there has maybe an hour, if that." "Then why?" Thessaly said slowly. "Is she still working?" Nobody answered because nobody knew. On the display, the warsuit's arm moved, not flailing, not the random twitch of a dying nervous system, but a slow, deliberate reach toward a panel on its own damaged chest. Somewhere inside 3 meters of scorched armor, in the vacuum-cold wreck of a battle that had already been decided, someone was still working. Thessaly straightened up. "Helm, bring us alongside. Dorothy, get me everything the suit's broadcasting, decoded on my screen in 5 minutes. And somebody wake the medical bay. We have 1 hour to decide whether we're about to watch a person die, or something we don't have a word for yet." The suit's name was stenciled across its cracked breastplate in human characters that the translation matrix rendered, after some deliberation, as Iron Widow, 7th seat. Thessaly stood in the observation gallery above the shuttle bay and watched the retrieval team drag the wreck in through the outer doors, its limbs hanging slack, its paint blistered black on one whole side where something had come very close to killing it outright. Even ruined, the thing had presence. It was built along roughly humanoid lines, twice the height of the pilot it presumably carried, its plating scored with old repair welds layered over older repair welds, like a tree that had been struck by lightning many times and simply kept growing. "7th seat," Dorothy repeated, reading the translation off her tablet as she jogged to catch up with the commander. "Does that mean what I think it means?" "I don't know what you think it means. That 6 pilots died in that machine before this one climbed into it." Thessaly didn't answer right away. She had read enough human military records in her career, scavenged, translated, catalogued by exhausted analysts trying to understand a species that fought wars the way weather happened, sudden and total, to know that human naming conventions for their war machines tended toward black humor. A ship called Unsinkable that had sunk twice. A squadron called Lucky 13 that had lost 11 pilots in its first year. It would not surprise her in the least if Iron Widow had earned its name exactly the way Dorothy feared. "Get me the medical report the second it's ready," she said instead. "And Dorothy, find out what she was broadcasting. I want to know what was important enough to spend her last hour of air on." The suit's cockpit had to be cut open, because its emergency release had fused shut sometime during re-entry through the debris field, and even the ship's engineers admitted they had never seen human alloy behave quite like that under stress, as if it had been designed to fail everywhere except the one place that mattered. What they found inside surprised all of them, though later, none of them could quite explain why. She was small. That was the first thing. Sergeant Maravas, according to the identification chip recovered from her flight suit, stood perhaps 160 centimeters, built lean and hard in the way of someone who had spent a career being underestimated by people twice her size and had stopped minding. Her dark hair was cropped short and matted with dried blood from a cut along her hairline. Her right arm hung wrong, clearly broken. Frostbite had already begun to whiten the tips of 2 fingers on her left hand, and her eyes were open, She's conscious, the medical officer said, disbelief plain in his voice as the scanners confirmed it. Barely. Core temp 31 degrees. Blood oxygen critical. She should not be conscious. Mara Voss looked up at the ring of alien faces bent over her. Skin the color of old copper, eyes like polished stone, for fingers where a human hand would have 5, and did not scream, did not flinch, did not do any of the things the crew of the HFY Current had privately braced themselves to witness. She said something. Her voice was a thread, barely audible even to the translation matrix's sensitive pickups, and it took the system 2 tries to render it cleanly. What it produced was, did it send? Dorothy, standing at the edge of the group with her tablet still in hand, looked up sharply. Did what send? Mara's eyes found Thessaly noted, the youngest and least imposing member of the boarding party, as if some part of her, even now, was triaging threats and choosing the safest thing in the room to talk to. The beacon, Mara said. Her lips were cracked, her breath a rattle. Coordinates. Did it go out? It's still transmitting, Dorothy said, because it seemed important to answer honestly, even though she had no idea what the coordinates meant. It hasn't stopped. Something in Mara Voss's face changed. It was not relief exactly. Thessaly would turn the memory over many times in the months that followed and never quite settle on the right word for it. It was closer to a held breath finally released. The look of someone crossing an item off a list. Good, Mara said, and closed her eyes. And for one terrible second the medical officer's monitors screamed that they had lost her. She had not, in fact, died. But she had stopped fighting to stay conscious, because, as would become clear over the following hours, she had never been fighting to stay conscious for her own sake in the first place. They stabilized her in the ship's medical bay, working with equipment calibrated for 4 species that were not human and improvising the rest, and Thessaly spent that first night doing what she always did when she didn't understand something. She read. The Vel Concord had been observing the human war carefully from a distance, through drone probes and salvage data and the occasional captured transmission, for almost 6 years. It was not the Concord's war. Humanity was, as far as anyone in Vel space could determine, engaged in a long and vicious conflict with a species the humans called the Revan, an expansionist power that had been carving through the outer colonies for a decade with a brutality that had made even the notoriously cautious Concord councils sit up and take notice. The Concord's official position was neutrality. Its unofficial position, held by an increasing number of officers like Thessaly who had spent too many years watching, was that neutrality was starting to feel like a euphemism for something less comfortable. Kes-9 had been a human mining colony of perhaps 40,000 people. 3 days ago, a Revan strike fleet had come out of transit above it with no warning and no demand for surrender, and had begun, methodically, to destroy the orbital ring that was the colony's only lifeline to the surface. A human defense squadron, undersized, outgunned, exactly the kind of force a dying frontier colony could actually afford, had scrambled to meet them anyway. Thessaly found the squadron's roster in a data fragment recovered from a drifting corvette's black box. 6 names, 6 call signs, 6 mech designations under a unit heading. Iron Flight, Widow, Anvil, Splinter, Hollow, Ledger, Thorn. She cross-referenced the names against the wreckage cataloged in the debris field. It did not take long. Anvil, Splinter, Hollow, Ledger, Thorn. All destroyed, all pilots confirmed dead. Scattered across the same field of wreckage the HFY Current had dropped into 6 hours earlier. Only 1 designation was unaccounted for among the confirmed kills. Widow. Thessaly sat with that for a long time before she went looking for the suit's own maintenance log, half expecting what she'd find, and finding it anyway with a chill she hadn't braced for properly. Iron Widow, the machine, not the woman inside it, had a service history stretching back 4 years and through 6 prior pilots, each entry ending the same clipped way. Pilot Kia. Unit recovered. Unit repaired. Reassigned. Mara Voss was the 7th person to climb into that cockpit. Every single one before her had died in it, and she had spent the last hour of her own dying not trying to get out. Mara woke for real 2 days later, in a room built for a species she'd never met, breathing air that had been quietly reblended overnight to match human atmospheric tolerances, with a broken arm and a brace her doctors would later admit was more elegant than anything human field medicine could produce. Thessaly was there when she woke, because Thessaly had made a point of being there, sitting in a chair too small for her frame with a data slate balanced on her knee, waiting. "You're not Revan," Mara said. Her voice was stronger now, rough but clear, and her eyes, pale gray, sharp, even half-drugged on painkillers her body had never been designed to metabolize, went straight to the details that mattered. Different bone structure, different insignia, a ship interior built with proportions that didn't match anything in the Revan design philosophy her intelligence briefings had drilled into her. "No," Thessaly agreed. "We're Vel, Concord Survey Vessel Ashvale Current. We found you adrift in the debris field above Kes 9. Mara absorbed that with the flat, assessing calm of someone filing new information into a threat matrix rather than reacting to it emotionally. "Concord's neutral," she said. "I remember the briefings. You don't take sides." "We don't," Thessaly said. "Officially. And unofficially?" "Unofficially, 3 days ago we watched 40,000 civilians die because 6 pilots in outdated hardware bought their evacuation ships 4 extra hours, and I have spent 2 days trying to decide what neutral is supposed to mean after you've seen something like that up close." Thessaly set the data slate down. "You're the 7th widow." Something flickered behind Mara's eyes, not surprise exactly. More like the wariness of someone whose worst-kept secret had just been read back to her by a stranger. "You went through the squadron records." "I did. 6 pilots, 6 deaths, 1 machine. And a 7th who spent the last hour of her own life making sure a signal finished transmitting instead of trying to save herself." Thessaly leaned forward. "I would like to know what was in that signal, Sergeant Voss. And I would like to know why a person who had every reason to fight for her own survival chose, instead, to spend it on coordinates." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside the small viewport, Kes 9's ruined ring turned slowly against the black. "Because surviving wasn't the mission," she said finally. "It never was." The story came out slowly over the following days, not because Mara was reluctant to tell it. She wasn't particularly once she'd decided the Vel weren't a threat, but because she was still healing and because some of it Thessaly came to understand was simply hard to say out loud. Iron Flight had been formed 18 months earlier as a stopgap, 6 pilots and 6 aging mechs cobbled together from 3 different colonial militias after the regular fleet had been pulled back to defend the core worlds and the frontier had been left. In the blunt phrasing of one supply requisition Mara quoted almost word for word, "to hold as long as it can with what it's got." Kes 9 had never been meant to survive a determined Revan assault. Everyone in the squadron had known that from the day they were assigned there. The mission was never to win. The mission was to be expensive enough for long enough that the people who could actually escape got the chance to. "Anvil went first," Mara said on the 3rd day, staring at a point somewhere past Thessaly's shoulder. "Reactor breach, 2nd wave. Then Hollow, then Thorn. That was quick, at least he didn't—" She stopped, started again. "Ledger held the longest before me. Almost 40 minutes passed when the tacticians said the position should have collapsed." "And you?" "I had the beacon relay," Mara said. "Iron Widow's the only frame in the flight with a hardened long-range array, legacy hardware, built for a colony survey ship originally, retrofitted into the mech when everything else got stripped for parts. My job was never to win the fight. It was to survive long enough to confirm the evac convoy cleared the debris field, and then broadcast a coded burst to the relief fleet with exact coordinates for a safe transit lane through the wreckage. Revan jamming would have scrambled anything sent from the ground. Had to come from altitude, had to come from a hardened system, had to come after the convoy was clear, so I wasn't broadcasting their position early." She looked at Thessaly directly for the first time since she'd started talking. "The relief fleet's 3 days out. Without that lane, they fly into a debris field this size blind, at speed, and half of them don't make it through intact. With it, they thread the needle in under an hour." Thessaly sat with that for a long moment. "So the beacon wasn't a distress call?" "No. It was a gift. For people who weren't even here yet. It was the job," Mara said, and something in the flatness of it told Thessaly this was not modesty. It was simply, to Mara Voss, the truth. 6 people died getting that beacon into position. I wasn't going to let it fail because I decided living mattered more than finishing what they started. It was Dorith, young, still new enough to the Concord's careful diplomatic distances to ask the questions the senior officers had learned to leave alone, who finally asked the thing everyone had been circling. "Why do they call you Widow?" Mara was out of the medical bay by then, walking the ship's corridors with her arm still in its brace, adjusting slowly to gravity plating tuned for a heavier species and to the low copper light the Vel preferred over the white glare humans favored. She'd taken to the observation deck in the evenings, ship evenings, an arbitrary cycle the crew kept out of long habit rather than any actual day-night pattern this deep in the black, and Dorothy had taken to finding excuses to be there too. Mara looked at the girl for a moment. She thought of Dorothy as a girl, though by Vel reckoning she understood the ensign was a fully qualified adult with a service record of her own, and then looked back out at the stars. "Because the suit outlives everyone who climbs into it," she said. "Call sign's not about the pilot. It's about the machine. Widow because it keeps surviving fights that kill the person flying it." She flexed the fingers of her splinted arm, testing the ache. "First time I heard that explanation I was 19 years old, and it seemed like the worst joke I'd ever heard. 6 years and 6 funerals later, I don't find it funny anymore. I just find it accurate." "But you survived," Dorothy said. "You're the first one who has." "Barely," Mara said. "And only because a Concorde ship happened to be in position to fish me out of vacuum before my reactor finished dying. If you hadn't come, I'd have been Widow number 7 on that list, same as the rest." She said it without self-pity, a simple correction of the record, the way a person might correct someone's math. "I didn't survive because I was better than them. I survived because I got lucky at the exact moment it counted, after doing the same job they did." Dorothy didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one. She stood next to Mara at the viewport instead, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the stars turned slowly overhead the way they always did, indifferent to any of it. The trouble started on the 5th day, and it started, as trouble often did in that quiet corner of the war, with a sensor ghost that turned out not to be a ghost at all. "Contact," said the Ashvale Current's tactical officer, a broad-shouldered Vel named Carant who had spent most of the mission bored out of his mind logging debris trajectories, and whose voice now carried an edge that brought Thessaly out of her chair before he'd finished the word. "Multiple contacts, emerging from transit at the debris field's outer edge. Signature matches." He checked again, clearly hoping he was wrong. "Signature matches Revan light cruiser configuration. 4 of them." Thessaly was on the bridge in under a minute, Dorothy close behind her, both of them arriving in time to watch the tactical display populate with 4 hostile icons crawling in from the field's edge, moving with the unhurried confidence of a force that expected no resistance. "What are they doing back here?" Carant asked. "The engagement's over. They won. There's nothing left to fight." "There's a beacon," Thessaly said grimly, and everyone on the bridge understood at once, because they'd all read the same report Mara had given 3 days earlier. "A working relay still broadcasting coordinates to a relief fleet. If the Revan Command has any idea what that signal is worth, they're not coming back to mop up survivors. They're coming to silence it before that fleet arrives." Dorothy's stomach dropped. "Can they trace it back to Iron Widow?" "Iron Widow's not broadcasting anymore," Carant said, checking his readouts. "Its reactor died before we brought it aboard, remember? Whatever they're tracking, it's not coming from the suit. It's—" He stopped, went very still. "Commander, the relay's still running. It's just not running from the suit anymore." Ashvale Current's own comm array picked up the burst pattern and started auto-relaying it 3 days ago, as a courtesy protocol, because it read as an open distress frequency, and our systems are built to keep those alive. He looked up, ashen. "We've been rebroadcasting Maravas's beacon this entire time. From this ship." The silence on the bridge lasted exactly as long as it took Thessaly or to understand the shape of the problem in full. A Concorde vessel, officially neutral, sitting directly in the path of a Revan strike force that was about to conclude, correctly, that the ship in front of them was the reason the beacon they'd come to silence hadn't stopped. "Options," Thessaly said. "We could kill the relay," Carant said. "Right now. Stop rebroadcasting, power down the array. Let them think the signal source is gone and pass us by. And the relief fleet flying blind into a debris field at speed because the coordinates they need stop arriving?" Dorothy said, before she could stop herself, and then flinched, because contradicting the tactical officer in front of the commander was not something a junior ensign did. But nobody corrected her because nobody disagreed. Thessaly turned to look at the doorway, where Mara Voss stood, arms still braced, face pale, having heard enough of the exchange through the open corridor to understand exactly what was happening. "Your call, Commander," Mara said quietly. "It's your ship, your neutrality, your 6 years of not choosing a side in a war that isn't yours." She met Thessaly's eyes without flinching. "But I already spent the only thing I had left to make sure that fleet gets its coordinates. I'm not going to ask you to spend anything on it. I'm just going to tell you what happens if you don't. My mission fails 4 years into a war it took 6 of my friends to buy 4 hours for. That's the honest math. I won't dress it up prettier than that." Thessaly looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the tactical display, at the 4 Revan cruisers closing steadily through the wreckage, unhurried, certain of an easy kill. "Karant," she said, "keep the relay running." "Commander," I said, "keep it running." Thessaly settled into the command chair, and something in her posture shifted, the careful neutrality of 6 years falling away like a coat she'd finally decided to take off. "We are a survey vessel. We are not built for this fight, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to anyone on this bridge. But we are not going to sit here broadcasting a dead woman's—" She caught herself, glanced at Mara, corrected. "A living woman's promise to a fleet that is still 3 days out, and then switch it off the moment keeping it on costs us something. Dorith, get me every evasive transit vector this ship can manage through a debris field this dense. Karant, arm what we've got and figure out how to make 4 cruisers believe we're more trouble than we're worth. We are not going to win this fight. We are going to survive it long enough for the math to change in our favor." Mara Voss, standing in the doorway with a broken arm and a stare that had spent a career watching people make exactly this kind of decision and pay for it, allowed herself, for the first time since the Ashvale current had pulled her out of the dark, something that was almost a smile. "Now that," she said, "sounds like something I understand." What followed was not, by any honest measure, a battle the Ashvale current should have survived. She was a survey ship, built for long, careful transits and delicate sensor work, armored enough to shrug off micrometeorite strikes and debris impacts, not remotely designed to trade fire with 4 Revan light cruisers whose entire purpose was killing exactly this kind of target efficiently. Karant's weapons crew, 3 technicians who had spent their careers calibrating instruments rather than firing them, found themselves improvising point defense solutions on the fly with a speed that would have impressed any actual warship's crew, purely because the alternative was not surviving the next 10 minutes. The debris field saved them in the end, or rather, Dorotha's read of it did. She threaded the Ashvale current through the wreckage of the battle that had already killed Iron Flight, using the same drifting hulks and broken orbital struts that had claimed 6 human pilots as cover from Revan targeting arrays, weaving a path so tight and so unpredictable that the cruiser's gunnery crews, built for open engagements against maneuverable warships, kept losing clean-firing solutions in the debris shadow. "They're not adjusting for the field," Dorith said, teeth gritted, hands steady on the controls despite everything in her wanting to shake. "They're used to fighting in open space. This is a mess. They hate messes." "Then let's give them more mess," Thessaly said, and ordered Karant to vent 3 cargo pods of scrap and spare hull plating directly into the cruiser's approach vector, adding fresh clutter to a field that already had more than enough. It bought them minutes, not victory. 1 cruiser's opening salvo clipped the Ashvale current's port shielding hard enough to throw the whole crew off their feet and blow half the bridge's secondary displays into sparking uselessness. Karant took a return shot that staggered the lead cruiser's shields, more luck than skill, and the crew allowed themselves 4 seconds of ragged cheering before the tactical display reminded them that 3 more cruisers remained, and that the lead one's shields would recharge within the minute. It was Mara who broke the stalemate, and she did it from a wheelchair the medical bay had produced for her because her legs, still recovering from frostbite and vacuum exposure, weren't reliable yet, parked in front of a console Karant had rigged for her at her own insistence. "Your point defense grid's fighting these ships like they're separate targets," she said, watching the tactical display with the flat, professional focus of someone who had spent 6 years studying exactly this kind of engagement from the losing side. "They're not. Revan cruiser doctrine runs coordinated approach vectors. Watch the spacing, it never changes. They hold formation like it's scripture because it lets them overlap firing arcs. If you time a spread into the gap between Cruiser 2 and Cruiser 3 instead of targeting either one individually, you catch both their approach vectors at once. I watched Ledger do exactly that 40 minutes into her fight before the shot that killed her, and it worked. It just wasn't enough that day, because she was one mech against a whole strike group and had nothing left after. "We're not one mech," Karant said, already keying in the firing solution she described, hope entering his voice for the first time since the engagement began. "We're a full ship with a weapons crew that isn't dying yet." The spread caught Cruiser 2 and Cruiser 3 exactly where Mara said it would, in the overlap of their formation doctrine, and for the first time in the engagement 2 Revan ships broke formation at once. Peeling apart to avoid a shared kill zone neither had anticipated a survey vessel understanding well enough to exploit. It was not a decisive blow, but it was the first moment in the fight that belonged to the Ashvale current instead of to the ships hunting her, and on a bridge that had spent the last several minutes simply trying to survive each passing second, that first moment of actual advantage landed like oxygen. "Sensors," Thessaly called, not daring to hope yet. "Anything on the relief fleet's ETA?" 14 minutes, Dorothy said, checking the numbers twice because she didn't quite believe them either. "They picked up the increased transmission volume from our relay and adjusted their approach vector to close faster. Commander, I think they know something's wrong down here. I think they're coming in hot because of us." Thessaly allowed herself, for the first time since Karen's voice had cracked with the word contact, to believe they might actually survive this. "Then all we have to do," she said, "is last 14 minutes. They almost didn't. The third cruiser, driven off formation by Mara's exploited firing gap, came around hard and fast on a vector nobody had predicted, close enough that for one gut-dropping second the Ashvale current's entire bridge crew watched its weapons ports charge on a direct line to the ship's unshielded engineering section, the one place a single solid hit would end the fight in the Revan's favor regardless of anything else happening in the battle. There was no time for a firing solution. There was no time for anything except the raw animal instinct of people who had, each in their own way, decided in the last 20 minutes that this fight mattered enough to die trying to win it. It was Mara who saw it first because Mara had spent 6 years learning to read exactly this kind of vector in the last half-second before it became fatal, and she didn't hesitate. "Hard roll 30 degrees now," she said, and Dorothy, trusting a voice that had earned that trust in the space of 5 days more thoroughly than most people earned it in years, threw the ship into a roll that had no tactical logic behind it except the desperate word of a woman who'd watched 5 friends die learning exactly this kind of lesson. The cruiser's shot went wide, clipping the outer hull instead of the engineering core, and the Ashvale current shuddered and held. "Karant," Mara said, already turning to the next problem, voice steady despite everything. "That cruiser's weapons need to recharge for 11 seconds after a full-spread shot like that. It's the same doctrine. Hit it now before it resets." Karant hit it now. The third cruiser's shields buckled and failed, and its own crew, whatever their orders had been, whatever certainty had brought 4 ships back to a field they'd already won to silence a signal that refused to die, apparently decided that a survey vessel this stubborn was no longer worth the cost. It broke off, falling back toward the field's edge, and a heartbeat later the 4th cruiser, still recovering from the earlier spread, followed it. That left only the lead cruiser, shields still down from Karen's earlier lucky hit, alone against a ship it had expected to be an easy kill and was rapidly discovering was not, and against a relief fleet whose lead elements, Dorothy reported in a voice cracking with disbelief and relief in equal measure, had just dropped out of transit at the debris field's edge, for minutes ahead of schedule, weapons already hot. The lead cruiser did not wait to find out what a full human relief fleet, arriving to find its own advanced beacons still broadcasting against every expectation, was prepared to do about it. It ran. The bridge of the Ashvale current, in the minutes after the last Revan signature vanished back into transit, was a strange kind of quiet. Not the tense silence of a fight not yet over, but the loose, disbelieving stillness of people who had genuinely not expected to be alive to hear it. Thessaly sat in the command chair with both hands pressed flat against her knees, steadying a tremor she didn't want the crew to see, and watched the human relief fleet's lead cruiser broadcast a formal hail on an open frequency, the translation matrix working to render words that carried, even through the flat mechanical cadence of automated translation, something unmistakably like awe. "This is Fleet Commander Iris Call of the 3rd Frontier Relief Group, requesting to speak with whoever has been keeping our beacon alive." Mara Voss, still parked in her borrowed wheelchair, looked up at Thessaly and raised an eyebrow, and it was, Dorothy thought later, the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen on the sergeant's face since they'd pulled her out of the dark 5 days earlier. "That's you," Mara said. "Answer the woman, Commander. You earned it." Thessaly opened the channel. The full story took longer to untangle than the battle had taken to fight, and it came out over the following hours in pieces, passed between two fleets that had never expected to speak to each other and were now doing so across an open frequency with the careful, deliberate courtesy of people who understood exactly how much had just gone right. The 3rd Frontier Relief Group had been flying dark and fast for 3 days, racing a clock nobody aboard had been certain they'd beat, following coordinates from a beacon that, as far as their own intelligence had led them to expect, should have gone silent the moment its pilot died. When the relay kept transmitting hours past its projected failure point, and then kept transmitting for days past that, Fleet Commander Call had made the decision, against the advice of at least 2 of her own staff, to push the fleet's approach vector harder and faster than doctrine recommended, betting that a beacon that refused to die was worth the risk of arriving early into a debris field that might still be contested. "We didn't know a Concorde ship had picked it up," Call admitted, once the introductions and the disbelief had settled into something closer to ordinary conversation. "We didn't know there was a Concorde ship anywhere near Kes 9. As far as our intelligence was concerned, that beacon was still broadcasting from a dying warsuit with nobody left alive inside it. We came in expecting to recover a body and a black box. We did not expect to find the actual person who sent it, alive, sitting in the command chair of a ship that had just fought off 4 cruisers to keep her signal running." "I wasn't in the command chair," Mara said, when Thessaly relayed that to her, with the flat honesty that seemed to be simply how she operated. "I was in a wheelchair with a broken arm giving firing solutions to a crew that had never fought a real engagement before today and did it anyway. Give the credit where it actually belongs." Thessaly, listening to that, thought privately that the credit probably belonged to both of them, and to a great many other people besides, to Dorith, who had threaded a survey ship through a debris field with the nerve of a combat pilot twice her experience, to Carant, who had turned instrument calibration technicians into a functioning weapons crew inside of 20 minutes, to a Vel Concorde that had spent 6 years telling itself neutrality was the responsible choice, right up until the moment it had to actually decide with lives on the line whether that was still true. But she didn't say so out loud because Mara Voss did not strike her as someone who needed the point argued, only understood. The safe transit lane held. The relief fleet threaded the debris field in just under an hour, exactly as Mara's original beacon had promised it would, and began the slow, careful work of recovering what could be recovered from Kes 9's ruined ring. Survivors from evacuation ships that hadn't made it fully clear before the Revan strike, salvageable colony infrastructure, and, with a solemnity that translated across species without needing a word of it explained, the wreckage of 5 mechs and the remains of 5 pilots, who had bought the fleet the 4 hours it needed with the only thing any of them had left to spend. Mara stood at the observation deck viewport for that part, on legs that were still unsteady, refusing the wheelchair for the first time since the battle, and Thessaly stood with her, not because protocol required it but because it seemed, after everything, like the kind of thing a person should not have to watch alone. "Anvil's real name was Toma," Mara said, watching the recovery ships work. "Splinter was Ewan. Hollow was a kid named Priya who'd only been with the flight 4 months. Ledger was Casimir. Everyone called him Cass. I don't actually know anyone who called him by his full call sign more than twice. Thorn was Beatrice." She said each name like she was setting something down carefully, the way you'd set down something that might break if you weren't paying attention. 6 pilots. 1 suit's worth of history. And I'm the 7th name on that maintenance log, and the first one who gets to walk away from it. "You don't sound like you think that's fair," Thessaly said. "I don't think fair's the right word for any of it," Mara said. "I think I got lucky at the exact second luck mattered, and 5 people who were just as brave and just as good at the job didn't. I'm not going to pretend that's justice. It's just what happened." She was quiet for a moment. "But I'll tell you what I do think is fair. I think it's fair that the beacon they died buying time for actually worked. I think it's fair that 40,000 people who evacuated Kes 9 are alive right now because of 6 pilots and outdated hardware and 1 Concorde survey ship that decided, when it counted, that neutral wasn't a word that meant what it used to mean. That part, at least, came out right. The formal first contact between the Vel Concorde and the Human Frontier Coalition, the real one, the diplomatic kind, with credentials exchanged and treaties eventually drafted and historians on both sides arguing for decades afterward about exactly how it should be characterized, happened 3 weeks later, in a conference chamber on a neutral station near the war's shifting front, and by every account it was a stiff, careful, deeply formal affair conducted with the caution of two civilizations that had never properly met and had a great deal to lose by getting the first impression wrong. It was not, by any account that mattered to the people who had actually lived it, the real first contact at all. The real one had already happened, 5 days into a debris field above a colony called Kes-9. In the moment, a Concord commander who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of watching from a safe distance looked at a dying woman's broken arm and a beacon that refused to stop transmitting, and decided that some things were worth more than the comfortable version of neutral. Mara Voss did not attend the formal ceremony. She was still recovering, still working through months of physical therapy for injuries that had nearly cost her both hands and most of the feeling in her legs, and by the time she was cleared to travel again the treaties had mostly written themselves without her. But Thessaly made a point every few months of sending word, a message across the growing web of communication now stitching two civilizations together for the first time, brief and unofficial and always ending the same way. The relay's still running, Sergeant. Whatever else changes, that part hasn't. And Mara, every time, sent back exactly 4 words, the same 4 words, because she had decided, somewhere in the long months of recovering the use of her own hands, that they were true and worth repeating. Good. That was the job. Iron Widow, the machine, never flew again. Its frame was too old, too scarred, too thoroughly built around a design philosophy the war had long since outgrown, and the Frontier Coalition's engineers, after careful assessment, recommended decommissioning rather than repair. Mara did not argue the decision, but she asked, and was granted, one thing, that the suit's stenciled nameplate, Iron Widow, 7th seat, scorched and cracked but still legible, be removed intact before the frame was broken down for parts, and that it be mounted, along with the names of 6 pilots who had never gotten the chance to walk away from Kes-9, in the small memorial hall the rebuilt colony eventually raised on the surface, where the light from a distant sun fell across it every morning at the same hour the original evacuation convoy had cleared the debris field 5 years earlier. Mara Voss visited it once, the year the memorial was finished, standing quietly in front of 6 names and 1 nameplate for a long time before anyone thought to disturb her. Thessaly, on assignment nearby with the first joint Vel-Human survey mission, an actual mission now sanctioned, funded, staffed by crews from 2 civilizations who had decided, in the years since Kes-9, that the alternative to cooperation had already been tried and found wanting, came to stand beside her without a word, the way she had once stood beside her at an observation deck viewport 5 years and 1 impossible battle earlier. 7th seat, Thessaly said eventually, reading the plate again, though she'd read it 100 times before. You're still the only one who ever got out of that suit alive. I am, Mara agreed. But that's not really the part of the name that matters anymore. She reached out, touched the cool metal of the nameplate lightly, the way you'd touch something you'd carried a long way and were finally allowed to set down. The suit outlived every pilot who flew it. Now it doesn't have to outlive anyone else. That's the part one get to be proud of. Not that I survived. That it's finally actually over. Above them, the light kept falling the way it fell every morning at that hour, indifferent and steady, on a name that had once meant only loss, and now, slowly, over 5 long years, had come to mean something else instead. The end.